Welcome back to CRESTCon, hashtag CRESTCon. And I'm really delighted to introduce Matt Lorentzen from Cyberis. Matt has decades of IT experience working within government, military, finance, education, and the commercial sectors. And earlier in his career, he was a Czech team leader. So now he's the principal consultant at Cyberis and an adversary simulation lead. So he delivers simulated attacks and penetration testing services to a diverse range of clients. He's spoken globally about industry security challenges, and today he's going to discuss how modern communication has evolved to be fast-paced and emotive, and what the implications for that are on our human operating system and on our security outcomes. So welcome, Matt. We're really looking forward to this presentation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to my talk. This is click here for more information. And this is really focusing on the use of language and how it influences our decisions. So a bit about me. I've been working in IT for a long time now. I started my life as a system administrator. So I've kind of got a good understanding of building systems from the ground up. After that, I ran an IT consultancy for a couple of years, which was very good for my career and very good for my personal growth, getting out there and trying to sell. After that, I sort of moved into a specific position at Hewlett-Packard, where that was my first introduction to penetration testing in check schemes, etc. And I've tested a range of industries over my career for the last 12 years. I really enjoy mentoring, and I'm a big proponent of skills development. I like to support that next level, the next industry, the next candidate industry. And I enjoy presenting and speaking. I think that it's a very valuable thing to do to understand a particular concept and get out there and really cement what you understand about that. I've released several open source tools really around emulating internal lab environments and how we can make those more realistic. So the concept of this talk was that when I started looking at simulated attack a couple of years ago, there seemed to be this assumption that a foothold was inevitable. I would talk to my peers and it was just accepted that sending in a phishing campaign with a malicious document would more than likely result in a foothold. This kind of caused me to reflect, like, what is this that people know that I don't? How do we ensure that this is always successful? Because in the concept of a simulated attack engagement, this is pivotal. This could really steer the overall outcome of the campaign. And I think some of the modern advice that we have around testing phishing and trying to implore people not to click on links isn't very helpful, because the reality of it is that links are everywhere in our modern day communication and really kind of the foundation as to how we share information and direct people to resources. We've built this into our very workflows and how people get access and authentication to things. Click here for access to your portal or validate this. So it's very difficult to kind of frame the conversation around you shouldn't really be clicking on stuff that you don't know, because in reality, people do get unsolicited information all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valid. So I started reflecting on this and I thought, well, what could be the factors to make somebody decide to interact with a campaign? Now, what is it that we do when we try and ascertain the legitimacy of something? And how, if I could understand that, how could I better frame my approach to that initial communication? So a quick agenda, we're going to cover off some of the morality that we should be talking about when doing this sort of stuff. I'll cover off some of the evaluation processes that our brain goes through when we're looking at this, how you can direct attention and why context is really important in that. We'll talk on language and grammar and how even word choice is really important and the weight that we place on these things. And then I'll talk about some visual style and some of my thoughts around how we equate something that looks professional and polished and how we can easily assign that some level of legitimacy. So moving into the morality stages, our director, Gemma Moore, wrote a really interesting piece on our blog about the responsibility that we have when performing these types of campaigns and the impact on people. It's a really interesting read, and Gemma's got some great insights into what we should be doing and how we should remember at all times that we are actually attacking people and what is the impact on those people. There's a bit of a grey area in terms of how far should we go in order to meet our objectives. And I really thought that was a valid point. Far too often it's all about win at all costs, and that isn't really helpful to an organisation or the users themselves. So decisions. Okay, so what we're talking about here is decisions and how we make decisions and evaluate the information that appears in front of us. In reality, we have to make decisions all day long, both consciously and subconsciously. And this was a really interesting aspect for me to look at. So in terms of talking about decisions when I'm trying to influence an outcome, these are solicitation attacks. I like to consider them as solicitation attacks. And really, our decisions are generally based on the amount of time that we have, which in most people's cases is limited. We're all really busy, and we can only really take a certain amount of time to try and come to a conclusion for something. And so we can only make that judgment based on the amount of evidence that we see in front of us. And this is really important because, you know, we don't really have all of the time to sit there and consider all angles of a problem. We really have to come to a decision on that basis. But making that decision, our biases, our personal biases play a lot into this. Now, have we had this communication before? Do we know this organisation, or do we have any affiliates within this organisation? Now, all of these things will add weight to whether we make a trusted judgment on what we see in front of us as being real. And also our own state, so our mental state, whether we're tired, what our health's like, whether we have other worries within our environment. All of these things can impact our decision-making process. Even things like hydration have been proven that if you're even 2% dehydrated, that can relate to almost a 20% decrease in cognitive performance. So all of these things influence how we're trying to understand what it is in front of us. An environment, so if it's noisy, if it's hot, if it's loud, if it's difficult to work, you know, distractions can kind of break our train of thought for a moment, and that can obviously be that can influence the outcome. So there's something called the OODA loop, which was created by an American fighter pilot called John Boyd. I'll leave you to go and research, but he was very successful in air combat, and people wanted to understand why that was the case. And so there's this sequence within an OODA loop, which is a 4-sequence process. The idea that we go around this every time we're making a decision. That's a simplified version. It goes into much more detail. But the idea was that he had the ability to observe a current state in an attack and almost preempt where that would be and orientate himself to that position really before his adversary had a real idea of what the outcome could be. And then once he'd orientated himself into a position, he could make a very quick appraisal of what he was going to do, what would be the next possible move. He would decide on that very quickly, and then he would act. And his ability to go through that process was much quicker than other people, and that was largely down to his ability to preempt. There's also a great quote from Wayne Gretzky, who's a very famous American hockey player, and they asked him, like, why are you so good? And he said, well, most people skate to where the puck is, but I skate to where the puck is going. So that ability to preempt in our decisions as to kind of ascertain based on the evidence in front of us is really quite an important factor. But in the end, a lot of our decisions are based around impulse, and all of these factors that I've registered in this list can certainly affect that outcome. So I've got a quick question here that I'm just going to put up on the screen and let you read for a couple of seconds. And I would really like you to just let your intuition come to a natural answer quite quickly. So this is an example of a cognitive reasoning test. This isn't a CREST registered tester question. And the idea is that when you read through this test, you come to a natural answer very quickly. So in this context, the answer is actually 5 minutes. But some people will have come to the conclusion that it could have been 100 minutes. And that's based on how the numbers are presented to us. You know, we can see ratios here, 5 machines, 5 minutes, 5 widgets. But the fact that the time is taken out of the second example, we kind of fill that in based on a sort of an intuitive, impulsive decision. And so this is your intuition in process drawn to the idea of quantity. And essentially, regardless of whether we've got 100 machines or 1,000 machines, it still takes 1 machine 5 minutes to make a widget. And so that's quite an interesting sort of test as to how our brain can quickly appraise something and potentially come to a different conclusion. There's other tests such as bat and ball problems, etc. But a lot of this, these concepts came from a book that I read a couple of years ago, probably 10 years ago now, called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who's an Israeli professor. He actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for a Nobel Prize for economics. And what they propose is that the brain has got two modes of thinking, and they label them quite helpfully and simply, system 1 and system 2. And understanding this is important in how we think and therefore how we come to conclusions. So system 1 is our impulsive, sort of intuitive gut reaction to danger, and it's really part of our evolutionary journey. It's the reason why we're sort of so good at looking at people's faces and making judgments. The idea is that it's a protective force, essentially, but it's very fast. It can be at times involuntary, so we don't even really know that we've come to a conclusion of something before it's happened. And then to a large extent, it has to convince itself of something and then it moves on. Whereas system 2 is our second mode of thinking. And this is much more deliberate and this is much more attentive. We focus on a problem and we give it our full attention. And we really try to ascertain what the details are within that problem. But as with all things, this is resource intensive. So our body tries to regulate the use of resources at any moment. And so the tendency for system 1 to take the lead, if you will, and try and work on intuition is important in that. And system 2 sort of monitors system 1 in the background at a distance, and it looks to disprove the judgments that system 1 has made, but only if there's enough evidence to support that introspection. So it will always try and reduce that cognitive strain by kind of making these impulsive evaluations about what it sees in front of us and the biases of whether it's seen it before, and it really kind of gathers this evidence quite quickly to come to that conclusion. So knowing that we have these two different modes of thinking, these two systems, and that system 2 is much more focused on the details, it's probably fair to say that we would probably want to instigate system 1 type processing wherever possible. We want it to come to the conclusion that whatever it sees in front of it is safe. Regardless of whether this is actually the truth or not. We're trying to draw this concept of legitimacy to prompt somebody to interact with something that they believe is legitimate. And so ensuring that the type of language that we use and everything else doesn't really engage system 2 in that. So system 1 generates these impressions and feelings. It's really where our inclinations come from. As I said, it operates very quickly. We don't really have much control over it. It infers and it invents causes. So, it can sort of take pieces and try and build themes from those. It's biased, and it's actually biased to believe and confirm. And it neglects ambiguity. So there's this concept of confirmation bias. So if a piece of evidence doesn't actually kind of align to what it's already made its first impressions of, it will seek out pieces of information that actually confirm what it originally believed rather than to discount that. And it actually does this from a limited set of basic assessments. So it doesn't take too long to come to this overall perception that something is correct or not, and make a decision on that basis. It tends to take the easiest route. So if you have the option for an easy question or a hard question, more than likely you're going to opt for the easy question. And this is a really interesting aspect. Responds more to loss than gain. So there's this concept of loss aversion. And I think that's why it's effective when people use these types of principles in phishing attacks, where they're talking about your account is going to be lost, or this is going to be removed from you and your access is going to be revoked. We are geared towards trying to maintain what we have and protect that above and beyond looking to try and gain other things. So what we're talking a lot about here is the use of language and how language can be used to guide these systems and this appraisal solution. And when we receive emails and correspondence from people, we tend to read in our heads. And this is a concept called subvocalization. This is really down to how most people are taught to read. So you would be requested by your teacher or your parents to read aloud so that they can hear your dialect and your pronunciation of words, and they can prompt you if you're getting stuck. And then once you've got that process nailed down, then you're taught to read in your head, because obviously a class of children all reading aloud would be quite noisy and disruptive. But it's actually difficult to not read in that way if you've never made any conscious effort not to subvocalize. And a lot of the time, the words that we use as secondary, we kind of place weight on certain words, and we look to try and extract ideas out of those words, and we try and make connecting themes from this information. We also expect a personal experience. So if you've received an email from somebody else, as you're reading it, you start to form a perception of this person in your head, almost subconsciously. And based on the word choice, you start to kind of get a feeling of what it would be like to interact with that person. You know, are they abrupt? And are they kind, or do they come across as quite boring? And all of this we've inferred and kind of built a perception of based purely on the words that we've received, because there's no tone in that, there's no context or afflection going up and down with your words. It's very static. So we tend to fill that gap in the communication as a need. As I said, so adds tone, meaning and weight to sentences and words, and we create an emotional experience based on that. It's the reason why spelling is very important, because it validates a person's standard. Some people are very particular about spelling, and some people aren't so bothered. But you know, certain spelling, when it's quite obvious, makes you feel uncomfortable. It can have that sense of uncomfortableness about it. But I think people are now seeing the benefit of concise language. So communicating more efficiently with people is definitely a plus in modern society. And we've seen there's a whole industry that's emerged relating to this. I'm thinking of services like Grammarly, where they will profile what you're writing and then suggest a better way that you can communicate what it is that you're saying. We've also seen a transition in email clients, etc., cloud-based email clients, where that you start typing a word and now suggesting what it is that you're trying to say. That's very interesting, because that comes from a limited set of lists. Obviously, there's an infinite number of ways, probably an infinite number of ways that you could take a sequence of words and put them together and convey different meanings. And so obviously it doesn't have that capacity. So the fact that it's a finite list, in some senses, is directing communication and almost forming habits. Again, system 2, much easier to let system 1 just crack on with it. And so if you don't have to think about that and you kind of agree with the suggestion that's been given to you, you will take that easy option. So this is an example of the subvocalization that I mentioned before. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to read that in your head. You can read that out loud as well if you want to, but it works both ways. Okay, so as you went through that process, you kind of get a bit of a sense of what we're saying here. And then you would have got to this number. Now, you wouldn't have, in most cases, most people wouldn't read that number verbatim. They wouldn't, 182 billion. They would just see that as a large number, and that would be enough to satisfy that curiosity. So we have this selective subvocalization where it's needed. And then when there's bits of information that we don't actually have to pay too much attention to, it's fine for us to just kind of extract ideas out of that and just kind of build that into the overall theme. And the overall theme of this statement is that here is a person who is clearly busy and gets a lot of emails. I've also used this picture deliberately to associate with this piece of text. So from the looks of that image, she's in an office. It's quite clear that we can make that out. She's got a couple of screens. You know, it looks like she's got a lot going on. And she's got a good concentrating on her screen, so she's clearly engaged in whatever it is she's doing. Those are all important aspects that feed into what we're saying here is a person that's busy. Subconsciously, you may even have picked up a couple of other clues from this image that would have fed into your perception of what this person is. There's a couple of cuddly toys on the desk. So maybe, although she's very serious about her work and she's very organized, she's got a bit of humility about her, or she likes to, do things that just kind of lift the spirits. There's also a box of tissues there as well. So she's either really organized, or maybe she's that person that everybody kind of goes to. The point is that all of these judgments at different depths will come, and they will change depending on who's looking at that picture, and people will see different things from it. But as long as the picture complements what we're saying, that's really the message here. And we can change that. So we can take exactly the same statement, and now we can change the picture completely. And the context changes. So this is a much darker, it looks like she's in her bedroom. There's a guitar in the background, or it's a different lighting set. So it's much more mood and quiet. It looks like she's in bed or in her pajamas. She's got a cup of coffee or tea, depending on what you think that is. She doesn't look particularly engaged. So now this statement becomes ironic, because even if she has got 182 billion emails, it doesn't look whether she's particularly bothered about trying to do that work. So context is very important. It's also this idea that we can use authority to force people into actions based on the fear of consequences. I have mixed feelings about this. I do think that it's still a valid attack vector, but I think that it's fairly indeterminate because people deal with conflict in different ways. And so you may not always get the outcome that you want. And also, it could also be seen as a generational thing, like my generation and the generation before me. Maybe they were much more intuitive towards authority and prepared to accept those authority experiences than the next generation, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we feel much more independent, and so we're happy to challenge. It really depends, but the outcome could change depending on who that person is. So spoofing is an effective aspect of using authority, pretending to be somebody within a company. So I've had some interesting experiences with doing this and generally been quite successful. I can think of one engagement where we registered a domain that was very similar to the company's .co version, and we set up all of the infrastructure. And the idea was to spoof a communication from the IT manager into the organization to solicit a user to try and interact with a portal that had been built. And this was very successful, and we actually got a lot of people that believed that this was legitimate, made the decision that this was correct, and interacted. And that was based on their experience of this person. It actually turned out to be that I was on site a couple of months later delivering a completely different piece of work. And in the wash-up, that person was actually in the meeting. So as we're going around and we're introducing ourselves, we'll call her Sharon. I think the penny dropped for Sharon who I was, and it dropped for me who she was. And I was very much the brunt of the jokes in that room for a moment. But then when we got down to it, Sharon said something that was quite interesting, in that once she'd received a copy of the email, she had to question whether she'd actually written it. And I'd used language that she used publicly on blog posts and in LinkedIn, all these sorts of things. And so technically, she had written it because we'd utilised the language that she used habitually to form the basis of this pretext. As I said, it can create the opposite effect in terms of using authority, though. So this imposition on a deadline for people that are already stacked with work, it can actually have the opposite effect because they're looking to try and reduce the burden and basically get through their day. It can cause more of a review of what is it that I'm actually being asked to do, and actually, who is it that's actually asking me to do it? So authority, the approach to using authority has its place. And there's a different type of authority that we see now anyway, this concept of influencers. I find this fascinating that Elon Musk can just sort of make one tweet and you can measure financial incentive based on what he says. So we're moving into a world where people have much more influence on how they use language and what effects that can be. We also have this concept of accountability now that's kind of coming into how we interact with our solutions and therefore other people as end users. So many more third parties are involved in this. So, we're using those to either as shortcuts or to almost act as surrogate support structures in that. So if you've received any emails or you have this solution for things like Cortana briefings, you're almost being held accountable. They're looking at what it is that you've said, and they're saying, well, what are you going to do about it? There's no context to this. Cortana doesn't know whether I've spoken to this person the next day, just that at some point I sent an email and this is what I was going to do. So I find this very interesting because we start to bombard people with language, and services bombard us with language, or with the perception that we're trying to be supportive and these efficiency goals and this is going to make you much more productive. But actually they take our attention and they control some of this in terms of what is deemed important that we should have our attention drawn to. Understanding this, I think this opens the way to new types of attacks, different ways that we can start to use these services that people interact with on a daily basis, and have built some tolerance of and have some experience and have habits in using them to try and enforce some of this. So representing these Cortana briefings and trying to kind of get a feeling as to how people are receiving communications every day. So to illustrate some of the concepts of language and how language can be emotive, I've got two sentences here that I'd like to sort of dissect with you a little bit. And both of them have levels of emotiveness in them. They're designed to try and pull you in different directions. So the first one, I've tried to make you feel impatient by the statement. You know, this idea that somebody constantly pauses before their sentences, you know, you would reflect naturally when you read that on how that may make you feel. And, you know, that may change how you want to interact. Whereas the second sentence, it's much more measured. The person seems to be considerate of what he's saying. He likes to think about things for a second. And these are important words because constantly causes us to reflect on how we would feel if that happens all the time. But the second likes to think, that's a much more a rapport building type approach. He likes to think that, she likes to think that, I like to think that. And if you're having a conversation with somebody and they're starting to reflect back things like, I'm like you, then you know that in that language, they're building some sort of a rapport with you and some affinity. Also, in both of these sentences, there's the concept of time. In the first, we talk about it in the sense of pause, but haven't labelled how long that pause is going to be, and that just adds to it. He's constantly pausing, but we do not know for how long, and that may become very irritating or difficult to communicate with. Whereas in the second example, it is for a second. We state how long the time is going to be. So he likes to think about things for a second before he speaks. And so we make this judgment, this evaluation, almost involuntary, that we're, you know, are we prepared to accept the fact that somebody likes to think about something for a second before they speak? And in that context, we would draw the conclusion that that's the case. In the second instance, this is something that I've reflected on, which resolves. So this idea that we're posed a question and then there's a piece of that actually resolves that concept. And I draw this from music a lot, in the sense that when you're playing something in a key, you can create tension in a piece by shifting a chord to something which kind of makes you wait, or it creates this hanging type of approach. And then there's a release, the chord resolves back to the natural key. And when you hear it, it's very pleasing to the ear. And I think that we can have this same solution, these same ideas can be implemented in our communications if we think about it, not just as the words that we say, but how we're flowing through that communication. So kind of resolving the why. So if somebody's looking at this and they have a question, if we can resolve that question before they've even got there, then that's a good place to be. So in this example, you have registered. So we're asking you to do something. There's an interaction there. I'm asking you to register the software package, which may be that I'm asking you to run it. But then I tell you what will happen, which is it will automatically complete. Automatically is a very good one, because once it's done, you don't have to do anything and you can get on with your other tasks. So these are interesting concepts about how words can be powerful. And so we can map these types of things. I started thinking about words that, you know, could be very direct and how we could soften them. So interrogation is a good one. Interrogation sounds like a very loaded word. It feels very intrusive. Whereas technically somebody's evaluating something. Now that may be, they may be interrogating you, and it may be a fear aspect, but essentially that's an evaluation as to what you're saying. And there's other examples on there that kind of tie in. Submission is a good one rather than contribution. You know, if you're submitting a form, or you've contributed to the system, people prefer, you know, that kind of idea. And submission can also be taken into context. It can be seen as, relinquishment of power. So an example, like MMA term, like the fighter submitted because he got to a threshold that he couldn't continue anymore. So, you know, we have kind of biases that we attach to these words, and context is very important. Finalize is another one. It's very definite, isn't it? If something is finalized, that's it. But essentially we're saying that it's completed. The completed feels a little bit softer and less direct. So moving on to language specifically, so I've got some sentences here that I'd like to dissect with you. I think if you read through the first one, then it's quite clear that this is an authoritative sentence. I need you to do something and confirm. So I'm asking you to do something, and I want you to confirm that this is done. And I've also given a very definite time for that, by close of business today. So it's really taking that authoritative approach in the sense that I'm sure that you've got other priorities today, but this is for me, this is very important. I need you to do this, and I need you to confirm that this has been done. So there isn't really much sort of leeway there in terms of not getting this completed. It's a very clear outcome to a task you've been assigned. Whereas the second one can be seen as much more collaborative. I've attached the latest draft. So if you can go through this later, so there's still that concept of time, but we're not definitive in exactly when that has to be, and just check that all the links work for you. So I'm giving you an insight into what it is that I actually want to do. Checking the links, I want you to interact with things and just let me know what your experience is, and then that would be great. Would is a really interesting choice of word in this sentence because it expresses time in tense. So I got this from the Oxford Dictionary, indicating the consequence of an imagined event or situation. So we've pushed this into the past. I've asked you to do something. Historically, I've asked you to do something, and now I'm reflecting on the fact that you've completed that, and I've decided that that was great. You were very helpful. It was a good outcome for me. I asked you to do something and you delivered. You could change that to be check that all these links work for you. Then that would bode well for your upcoming performance review. But that changes the complete context of the situation. So great is a really good way of saying, I need your help. If you do this, it will continue to validate my opinion of you, that you are a helpful, collaborative person. And we can continue moving in a positive direction. I really like the last one, though. This is contribution, and this ties into some of our own personal needs. In many cases, significance, the human need for significance. So what do you think about this? When somebody asks our opinion and they want us to contribute our opinion, that's a very powerful, emotive sentence. People are naturally full of opinions about things, and if somebody asks you directly what you think, that can be a powerful draw to actually interact with that. And it also is a shortcut in the sense that I'm still asking you to do all of the other things. Does this work? Well, what does that mean? Well, it probably means that you're going to have to interact with something and go through to make that judgment. But really, the focus is on, I want to know what you think about this experience, not necessarily about what I'm asking you to do. So I found this book by Chris Voss, who's a former FBI negotiator. And I started thinking, well, how effective can language be if you're in a real crisis? It's a great read, definitely recommend it. I really enjoyed it. Imagine if you're in the position where what you say can potentially affect somebody's life. So there's some really good insights there into how we build the use of language and the types of things we say and what the impact of that will be in controlling the flow of a situation. In this case, a very precarious situation where there's a real risk to human life. And one of the things that he brought up was the power of no, and that really stuck with me. Now, this idea that when we ask people questions, you allow them the opportunity to say no to that. So we are conditioned for the fact that no can be seen as a negative word. It's not generally accepted to be always the right use of the term to say no, because it seems to be very closing. But Chris argues the fact that actually it gives people the ability to have a sense of control. So, this need for autonomy and knowing that I'm directing something. And so asking people questions that they have the opportunity to say no to really just kind of brings down the baseline to a place where there's a sense of trust because you've given them that freedom to be able to talk honestly to you. So just sort of touching on some examples of how this may be relevant. Perhaps you start with an affirmation that you apologize for intruding, because again, time is a factor. And so if you're taking somebody's attention for a second, it's always good to kind of try and justify the why of that beforehand. And then you're kind of acknowledging the fact that you've done something, something should have happened, but you're not sure whether that's because you've made a mistake or not. Did you get any errors when you went through this? Well, that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because did you get any errors when you went through this would imply no, because I've already authenticated and that's fine. Or actually, I haven't done this already. The reason that I haven't got any errors is because I haven't completed it yet. So then the next question is, well, should I interact with that? Has this pretext driven me to the point where this seems to be a legitimate thing that I should be looking at? And so asking questions that open up your paths to your goals is powerful. So I just want to touch on design a little bit here. As I said, I believe in the visual aspects certainly inform the perception of legitimacy. And so understanding some of the things that we can do around design are quite powerful. I'm quite a fan of using PDF solutions and integrating links and things into PDF wherever possible, because it really gives me this opportunity to bring home visual aspects and tie in things in a much more flexible way. So I like to add in things like barcodes and giving things the perception of something being official. And we see barcodes all the time, and we see reference numbers all the time, and it just feels like something is being tracked. And so that could potentially add weight to the fact that this is something legitimate. There's also some other subtle things in this that I've utilized that may not be immediately obvious, but the use of color. So if you look at the overall tone of the imagery, there's lots of white in the background. The lady in the middle is wearing a white t-shirt. The guy's got a nice kept white beard. So that kind of feeds into that. And we've also then got sort of a purpley colored top on the right-hand side. And, the links are magenta, so that's a complementary color. As well as the unique reference number box, that's the same sort of color palette as the overall design. So that's designed to draw your attention to that process. The links themselves follow the same font. So it's all trying to tie everything together into a cohesive manner, and subconsciously would look at that and evaluate how that feels. And color is a really important aspect of how we feed into decisions and what our brain does with how it feels about color. And so to demonstrate this idea, if you just call out the colors that are on the screen at the moment from top to bottom, and then if we change it and call out the colors again. So if I was successful in demonstrating that to you, you probably had to employ more cognitive effort in the second example than the first. And that's because there is a misalignment between the text and the actual color of the text. And when you're focusing one specific aspect, you don't see the word red and the color red as an independent in that first context. They're just a whole. And the moment that you try and create a separation between those two, that creates some mental taxing, and that can be quite difficult. So even understanding things such as color and how that can influence us and cause us to require more introspection of things that are in front of us is quite an important aspect, I think, and quite interesting to look at. Also, where our attention goes on the page. This is an example of a heat map where people are looking at an overall piece, and it clearly shows that people don't really care about adverts on the right hand side, and you can clearly see where all of these visual aspects are being focused on the page. So that's really interesting. In this idea of attention, where do we want people to look? If we're creating a capture portal or whatever, we probably want to shift that focus away from the address bar and try and move that to the other side, so that we're focusing on one aspect and we're not looking at a specific part of the page necessarily. And there's other things I've added into here. So there's people in the background that could be considered in an office environment, or people just like you. I'm not really sure what that drink is. That could be maybe an alcoholic drink or an apple juice, who knows. But certainly this idea of trying to push elements to different portions of a page to control that intention is interesting. And this isn't anything new. It always amused me that the ADFS portal, externally facing Active Directory Federation services system, which is very important to the overall structure of a domain, has this exact design where the authentication portion of the page is right over to the right-hand side, and there's generally either a custom image or something big on the left-hand side, which definitely takes your focus away from the address bar directly. And so if you set some expectations in an email about people having access to something, then you really need to meet those. So if it's a portal, it needs to be functional. People need to be able to interact with it and log in, and they need to have an experience. It doesn't have to be a completed experience, but it does need to be some level of experience to kind of add to that legitimacy. And concepts around where we're sharing with people things about themselves particularly stats about themselves, performance reviews, sales targets, all of those sorts of things related to how am I doing in my job. We place a lot of significance on our performance because people generally value their jobs. My job's important to me, and doing well in my job is part of my goal. So if I have things that I can measure my goal against, then that's very powerful. So in conclusion then, so we're going to continue to become conditioned by how our communication habits come through. We all receive a considerable amount of information every day, and we have to sit through that, and we often make very quick appraisals of what that looks like. And looking at how some of the tools that we interact with, how they're trying to steer our communication and direct our habits is quite interesting from both an understanding from our perspective, but also from an attacking perspective, and how we can potentially utilize some of those. Everything is trying to grab our attention and pull us back in. And so that's quite easy to develop habits where we just skim through stuff, because there really isn't any other way to be able to get through the volumes of information that we have to deal with. And so understanding when you can instigate engagement or disengagement in cognitive evaluation, that sounds like a real mouthful, but essentially knowing when to be able to target system 1 type thinking, very quick intuitive appraisal, and avoiding system type 2 thinking modes is quite good, and language steers our decisions in that process. So as I said, our decision process is flawed, it's impulsive, we don't really have much control over it at times, and it's very biased. The words that we choose can have a profound influence on where we go. And I think understanding this sort of stuff helps us build more robust defenses. So not just who has clicked on something and how many stats I've fished a certain number of people, how many people interacted, but more understanding why those people may have interacted as well. What type of language have we used? And incorporating some of these ideas into these concepts, I think, can help inform security a little bit. So I just wanted to say thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did in putting it together. I appreciate any questions that you've got, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt. I was riveted during that, and definitely a big fan of your book choices. I love Thinking Fast and Slow, and the other two. So I've got some questions, and the first one would be, what sort of pretext or attention framing is useful in your opinion when setting up phishing?
So pretext is an interesting one, but I think what I've tried to illustrate in the talk is how we want to try and infer actions without necessarily calling them out directly. So, for example, log in with your username and password. That's something that we control. That's very personal, and we know that we should guard that. But you can flip those types of sentences to things like once you've authenticated. And so now authentication is still the same thing. We're using our credentials to access something, but the once you've authenticated, it's putting it in past tense. We're reflecting back on it, and all of a sudden now the focus isn't on actually the action that I'm trying to get you to perform. The focus is on, well, what will happen once you've done that, and it almost diminishes the impact and the potential issues that could arise from you authenticating with that. So thinking about how we use words in our pretext and be very careful. I mean, if you read it back yourself and it feels like it's something that you would interact with yourself because you don't feel it's intrusive, that's a good start, I think.
Well, I think putting yourself in the reader's position is always a good call.
Absolutely.
So on that basis, is that the sort of same kind of recommendations for improving detection rates?
Yeah, so I think at the moment we're very much who clicked what, and what was the success of a campaign, and the metrics are used as measurement. But I think understanding why somebody interacted with that is equally as important. What was it that caused them to believe that this was legitimate? Was it tied to a company event? Was it relevant? Did it have some significance for them? And so purely on the basis that we're trying to understand what causes people to believe things, I think that can inform some of the phishing aspects above and beyond just sending in links that are maybe blatant and just trying to understand who could be fooled by that. Understanding understanding the motives behind it can help us inform users as to the types of things that we accept, and also a better reporting culture. So the NCSE mentions a lot about having a culture which has the technical controls in place, but also empowers people to be able to report these things. And it's not a blame culture. And at some point somebody will click something. So understanding why that has happened can just kind of inform the overall security controls in a more coherent manner, I think.
I definitely agree, and this is definitely the kind of learning while learning that I like to invest in. On that basis, just got one more question from the audience. So this is, do you try and get people to interact immediately?
It depends on time. So all of these things are time-based. So in an ideal situation, building up a rapport with somebody before you're even asking to do something is much more powerful. It comes back to that bias. If this is the first time we've interacted, then you may be less willing to kind of immediately impart some of that trust that inevitably gets formed. But over a period of time, it may be that just that sort of thing that I ask you to do, or even you ask me to do, it's just folded into that natural conversation. So in an ideal world, spreading out this communication over time is much more effective than sort of immediately asking somebody for a response. But that depends on how things are set up, really, and what the goals of the attack scenarios really are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for all of your answers and that just quite amazing presentation. I think I'm going to be watching that one again. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you. I think the next session is due to begin at 12:10. And so if anybody wants to be tweeting, it's CRESTCon, #CRESTCon for social media. We'll join you in a few minutes to see Ken Monroe. Thank you so much again. And hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did.